monetary policy. John Maynard Keynes wrote in the 1920s, 1930s, and came up with this theory, or is mainly credited with this theory, of government spending as a way to improve or to help out the economy. After World War I, Keynes, who was a British economist, came up with this idea that if the government spends a lot of money, it can actually keep a country or the entire world from falling into recession or depression. And the best example that I can think of is a bathtub. If you want to think about a bathtub, you fill up, you put the stopper in the drain, and you fill up the bathtub, and the water fills it up, and you can take your bath. Well, what would happen if you tried to fill up the tub, but it didn't have a stopper in the drain? The whole time that you were filling the tub, the water was still draining out of the tub. If you turned off the water, or the flow of water coming out of the spout was less than what was draining out of the bottom of the tub, then the water level is going to go down. And if you think about a recession or a depression as a drain on that economic tub, and the lower the water gets, the worse off the economy is, what can you do? Keynes' theory said that a government that can't go bankrupt and has the power to create money and influence the economy was the one entity that could actually make a real difference. And what he said is what governments need to do is they need to turn on the water full blast to try to keep the water from draining out of the tub faster than it normally would. So the drawback to that is that the government goes into a huge debt. We talked about debt and deficit in the last chapter, but Keynes' theory, and what he said is that in good times, when the economy is really strong, that's when the government needs to pay down its debt, to reduce its debt. And if the government does that, if it spends heavily during economic recessions and depressions, and then pays off all its debt when the economy is good, then a government can function pretty well and have a significant impact on the economy. So that works in theory. The problem, as we talked about in the last chapter, is that politicians and the people who vote them in don't like to raise taxes, and that's the main way that you buy down the debt. This was an issue. This was during the Obama administration, and one of the ideas that came up to help improve the economy was for the federal government to buy old cars and basically give people rebates for their old gas-guzzling cars, because then they would buy more fuel-efficient cars. It was an interesting idea, but we can see in the years since the Great Recession, gas prices have stayed really low, and so the demand for energy-efficient or fuel-efficient cars hasn't really increased a lot. In fact, in America today, one of the most popular vehicles is the SUV, and in fact, in recent years, major motor companies, car companies have quit producing regular four-door passenger cars or two-door passenger cars altogether, and the only thing they're making are trucks and SUVs. So sometimes the government can make decisions, but it doesn't mean that they can predict exactly what's going to happen in the future. Supply-side economists believe that cutting tax rates is the best way to help the economy because it'll stimulate the supply of goods. And supply-siders like the idea of lower tax rates. If you can keep the taxes low, then people are more motivated to work longer, increase their savings and investments, and ultimately produce more. One of the names to know from the text is Arthur Laffer, L-A-F-F-E-R. And Arthur Laffer came up, supposedly, I drew this out in the back of a cocktail napkin. What he theorized was that, and this was back in the 70s, maybe the 80s, what he theorized was that if the government taxes a lot of people's earnings, they're going to be less motivated to work. And at some point, if you actually cut taxes on income, people will work longer, and the money from the wages that they do make is actually going to come back to the government in payroll taxes. But it hasn't really worked out. That's the problem, is that it's a good theory, and Republicans and conservatives like to refer to Arthur Laffer as the reason not to tax or to have lower taxes, because they believe in what Arthur Laffer came up with in his theory, and that's that the government actually makes more money if the tax rate is lower. But it hasn't actually worked out in reality, and Laffer's theory, the Laffer curve is what they call it, has been kind of debunked by economists currently. You can kind of see in this cartoon that there are these two different ways of looking at the economy, and you can see on the left-hand side, a conservative's economic fantasy is if we keep cutting taxes and spend less, everything will be better. And a liberal's economic fantasy, if we raise taxes and spend more, everything will be better. Neither of those is 100% true, that and neither one is actually very reasonable when you think about it. So, I think it's worth kind of thinking about whether Keynesian or supply-side approaches are really better for the economy. Ultimately, Keynesian economic theory would work if you raised taxes during good economic times and spent during bad economic times, and that the supply side system would work fine if you actually spent less. The problem is that you can cut taxes, but people still want their goods and services.